everybody in a position that feels comfortable, that feels really stable and grounded. Just kind of shift around and make sure it's easy to sit upright. So sitting straight is important, but it shouldn't feel like a stressor or a strain. So just kind of, balance yourself around until you find that way of sitting where your legs are happy and your hips are happy. And it's completely fine to be in a chair. If you're in a chair, make sure that you're not leaning back. Sit up a bit and get some cushions to prop behind you if you need. And particularly because we're all probably in front of the computer a bit more than we normally are. And when you're on the computer, it's easy to forget your posture and, and kind of like, get into that or, sit in a strange way and then your back hurts. So even just sitting properly for meditation can give your body a chance to recover from all of the new positions you're forcing it into, or a lot more often. Okay, so like last week, we'll start with a meditation, then do a little talk, and then end with a meditation. And during the talk, you're very welcome to add anything or ask anything. So we'll start with meditation. And so if you want to just make sure that anything that is tense within the body is consciously released and relaxed. So bring a sense of having a very strong, stable back and a very soft, receptive front. Allow your spine to come into alignment. And become aware of your lungs and your stomach, particularly. And with your lungs, allow them to empty and fill as completely as they can. And your stomach to completely release and relax. Nothing held in, nothing tensed. So bring special attention to your torso, letting everything settle into its natural position. And as your body begins to relax, just gently adjust your motivation and think whatever temporary or self-focused intentions I had for coming are completely natural. And now I'm going to gently expand them and think whatever peace I touch and connect with, may it benefit those around me. Whatever stability and insights I come to, may it have a ripple effect benefiting all. So I do this practice for both myself and for others. And with that motivation, then shift your focus to the breath. If you're feeling a bit dull, focus on the breath at your nostrils. If you're feeling a bit anxious, focus on the breath at your stomach. But just choose one spot to centralize your focus on the breath and allow your attention to settle there. Every breath is a chance to come back into the present. If you miss one chance, you have another right away. So feel each breath as an opportunity, an invitation to come back home to yourself in this moment. And as you watch the breath, now add one of your ideals to the out breath and one of your ideals to the in breath. As you breathe in, connect with compassion. As you breathe out, connect with love. Breathing in, may all sentient beings be free of suffering. Breathing out, may all sentient beings have happiness. And just allow love and compassion to ride on the breath. It doesn't have to be verbal. Connect with the experience of these two. Bringing in and sending out. Breathing in compassion, breathing out loving kindness. These two ideals flowing through you and enriching you as they flow out and enrich others. And then let go of focus on the breath and just hold in your heart compassionate, loving kindness, concentrating it at your heart center. Picturing it like a sun that radiates out and warms you, radiates further out, warming others. And holding that idea, gently relax the meditation. Okay. So I think that when we do meditation that has any kind of association with the breath, it can be really powerful right now because we have a bit of fear about other people's breath, breathing on people. You know, we're so worried about this virus. Sometimes when we go out, we might be wearing masks, so that there can be a little bit of a stifled quality to the way that we're breathing lately, both worried about making others unwell and worried about them making us unwell. So if we can do meditation, just simple meditation on the breath, that's very calming and it's focusing. But if you can add to it compassion and kindness, it can make it really rich and also release any tension that might have built up about your own association with breath. You know, breath is life, but right now it feels like it could bring death too. And, you know, there can be a lot of tension and tightness that can happen with that whole process that should be so natural and healing for us every minute, can turn into something that actually is a bit tense. So that's one way. It's related to the giving and taking meditation, Tonglen, but it's a lot more kind of simple and a little less confronting. So from a Buddhist perspective, compassion is the wish for all sentient beings to be free from suffering. Loving kindness is the wish for all sentient beings to have happiness. So they're two sides of the same coin. And it's the work that we all do all the time anyway. But when you make it kind of simple and concrete and tangible in a way, and then let it be with something so natural as the breath, it's like you're giving your own values back to yourself, and you're nourishing yourself with what you already hold to be true and important. So it can be very powerful to take very simple things and sit with them intentionally and be fed, because you're doing a lot of feeding of others during the day. There's a lot of sending out, connecting. There's a lot more effort, I'm guessing, in the way that you send out, because not seeing people face to face, you have to use more of your verbal energy, less of your just awareness of space and silence. So because of that, I think it needs to be a bigger priority to nourish yourself, because you're expending so much more energy in this new format. Sometimes just getting organized with it, trying to find if you're connecting with people or not, just the mental energy of that can be quite tiring. There can also be a lot of really beautiful joy in this kind of new way of communicating. We can get a bit more creative. We can be a bit intrigued. You know, maybe there's some benefits that are starting to emerge now that we're starting to get used to it. But you know, there's an old saying in Buddhism that if you can, you should meditate every day for at least 10 minutes. But if you're very busy, you should meditate for 20. Right? So, you know, it's same thing holds true now. While things are a little bit more difficult, I think we need to give more attention to our heart and our path and being nourished, so that we as, you know, healing professions are healed at the same time. So if someone was to say to you, I have compassion fatigue. Would you know what they meant, and do you believe there's such a thing? Compassion fatigue. Is this a word you guys are using yet? Australians love it. It's usually an excuse to take time off work. Yeah, they have compassion fatigue. And what they're really saying is that they're burnt out, and that seeing the suffering of the world and seeing the suffering of their patients and clients is getting wearing, and they need a break. And there's something very natural and normal and important about having seen that, but labeling it as compassion fatigue or compassion burnout actually misunderstands what compassion is. If it's clean, clear, well-motivated compassion, you don't burn out. If it's raw empathy, absolutely you can burn out. Absolutely you can burn out. So we want to elevate the way that we're experiencing the suffering of others so that it doesn't have a wearing effect on ourselves. And of course, we're not perfect, and we'll get distracted, and it will tire us out sometimes, bearing witness to the suffering of those around us, as well as our own. But if we can reframe suffering and reframe compassion so that we understand that bearing witness to suffering does not give us suffering. Yeah, it does if we identify with it, if we feel like we need to solve everything immediately, if we get a sense of urgency with it, of course it can. But when we're asking ourselves, what makes me tired? It's not compassion. Other things are making us tired. What do you think about that? Do you agree, or are you finding that confronting? It might be an activity of compassion, but the compassion itself isn't what's making you tired. Yeah, Abigail. Yeah, nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. I completely agree with you. I would like you to clarify what you mean by raw empathy, because I think that if you're deeply empathic, you will also not burn out. So I don't know what you mean by raw empathy.
Yeah, maybe better to say like colloquial empathy, not the way self-psychologists talk about empathy. Yeah, the way that we talk about empathy just in the world of being with, without necessarily a compassionate motivation. You can use empathy as a tool, right? Empathy can be a tool of manipulation. It can be used for evil. It can be used for this. It can be used for that. But in the context of self-psychology, I think when you guys talk about empathy, it sounds very much like compassion from the Buddhist perspective. And I think you're quite right. You know, the form of empathy that you're all aiming for and striving for, I think, is basically the same as the Buddhist idea of compassion. And so when you're in alignment with that, you're less likely to get tired. It's very enriching. It can even give you energy, right? On a good day and a good session, when you're on track with it, it can be energizing. Even if you're with something that has a lot of suffering, it actually doesn't deplete you. So what about those sessions that do deplete you, or those days that do deplete you? What is it exactly that made you go off course, or you know, shifted in your being so that the very thing that is normally medicine became poison for you? It's an important place to investigate. So what do you all think when you get tired? Why? Besides the obvious, just not getting enough sleep.
I know that when I'm not grounded in myself and really spacious with my breathing, I can easily collapse into a superficial contact, which will tire me.
Yeah, I think maybe all of you would agree with that. I think you're quite right. Superficial contact is a lot more tiring than deep contact. Distraction is a lot more tiring than focus, but not at first. That's the danger zone, right? Is at first, shallow interactions and distracted focus are easier. at first.
Yeah.
But if you maintain them, they actually take a lot more energy because you're kind of going back and forth between different mental stimuli, trying to find something to hook onto and entertain yourself and keep that more superficial level of comfort and entertainment. And so that's the difficulty, is that at first, living in the superficial is easier. Living in the distraction is easier. And if we can remind ourselves that if you, as you said, if you ground yourself first, once you center yourself and you have a more deep interaction that's more meaningful, you're not as tired. It just takes a little bit more effort in the beginning. Yeah, the same with the difference between distraction and focus. It does take some effort to focus. But once you're a bit focused, it gets its own momentum, doesn't it? You know, once you're on, and, you know, then the day can flow really beautifully. So if we can remember this like tendency towards instant gratification that we have, where especially if things are more stressful than usual, we revert to what's immediate. Yeah, what's immediately easy, immediate relief, you know, and it makes absolute sense because our minds get too full up with details and strategies and putting out fires that to go deeply is going to take a little bit more effort than usual, forgetting that once you do, that becomes nourishing and you're less likely to be tired at the end of the day. Do you agree? Yeah, focus is harder, but once you're there, it's easier. Superficial is easier, but it's ultimately more wearing.
Can you say a few words about the focus? What do you mean when you say focus? That I am focused now.
Yeah. I mean, it's, you know, focused is what we would say focused is in the world, you know, having a single pointed attention, or a very awake and clear attention on what is in front of you as well as what's within you know, kind of colloquial mindfulness. When we're distracted, we're sort of half there, you know, we're half with what's happening, and part of us really wants to be stimulated more than this moment. And when we want to be stimulated more than this moment, it feels like a type of pleasure to multitask, right? To listen while texting, right? Or to watch while talking, you know, to eat while reading. It feels like added pleasure to multitask when you're in a kind of frenzied, busy mindset. And, you know, it is a superficial kind of pleasure that does work enough, which is why we keep doing it. Forgetting that if you can be brave through the transition point from hyperstimulated to relaxed and focused, if you can be with the transition point, the other end of it is a far deeper level of peace, in a far deeper sense of contentment, pleasure, happiness, well-being. It's just moving the mind from hyperstimulated to centered and calm. It's an uncomfortable transition. Yeah, do you know what I mean? And it's not like it's painful, it's not like it's that stressful, but it's like there's something in us that really doesn't want to shift gears, that really doesn't want to just hold still and be present. You know, have you ever said, why don't I have just a nice lunch quietly on my patio, eating slowly, looking at the birds? And you sit down to do that, and then you're like, I wonder what the news says. I should read the news. I'm going to read the news. Oh, I wonder, you know, and you get this kind of like, I need more. Yeah. But if you say to yourself, okay, I notice that I'm wanting more stimuli than this moment. How about I just notice that and wait and wait. Then in 5 minutes, you're loving the patio and you're loving the birds and you're loving your simple meal and you're being very nourished by it. But normally when we're stressed, we don't give ourselves a chance to down-regulate and settle into that natural healing ability that the mind and body have. If you just give it some space, if you just give it a chance, both the mind and the body are very self-healing with actually quite not very much effort. It's just that the transition from stress to calm feels like a struggle. Yeah, unless you remind yourself that that lag time is actually quite short-lived. That transition point doesn't take that long if you can be patient with it. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Yeah. And so now is the time to remember all of the things that we already know. Yeah, but to remember them more intentionally and with more strength. You know, you don't need a million new strategies. You don't have to do a million new things. It's remember what you know about how you function and how you dysfunction. Remember those more intentionally. And, you know, try not to get swept up into the frenzy of, you know, catching up to the new way of life. You know, remind yourself that effective work comes from your center, from your heart outward. Good work isn't doing the external work first and then kind of adjusting yourself internally and trying to get grounded. You have to start with yourself and then do the sending out. You know, it can feel like counterproductive, or it could feel inefficient to just stop and reconnect with your path, whatever that is, but it's going to make for a more enriching day. If you're just, you know, doing the activities of compassion, that's not the same thing as compassion. You know, you could be saying the right thing and giving the right face and giving the right space and cooking the right meals, and you could be doing everything right. But if your motivation isn't clear, it's going to be a more tiring day and a less effective day. Yeah. You feel less satisfied. You're like, I did all the things I'm supposed to do. Why do I feel dissatisfied? You know, you didn't connect first. And so, so give yourself a chance. Yeah, take some pause during the day. So self-compassion from a Buddhist perspective is something really different than self-compassion from a worldly perspective. From a worldly perspective, self-compassion often is equated with permission for indulgence. Yeah, permission for indulgence. You've earned the right to be indulgent because you've been working so hard. And so it's self-compassion to completely, you know, collapse in a heap and be a slob for a few days and, you know, go to the spa or, you know, whatever. That's the kind and good thing to do to yourself to nourish yourself, right? That's what the world says, right? Take some time out, right? Which is fine and functional on a certain level. But self-compassion from a Buddhist perspective is the category of teachings called renunciation, or the determination to be free, which doesn't sound compassionate at all to yourself on the surface because of the words. But what you're really saying is, the kindest thing I can do for myself is to stop creating the causes for suffering. The kindest, most compassionate thing I can do for myself is to let go of the habits that hurt me. Yeah, that's self-compassion. And so it requires a bit of self-examination. What do I say and do to myself that perpetuates my negative states of mind? You know? And are there any of those I can turn the volume down on? Are there any of those I can interrupt the momentum of? Are there any of those that just by noticing that I'm doing them, they lose strength and fall apart? Yeah, because sometimes just bringing awareness to what you're doing and saying is enough to wake up your wisdom again. So self-compassion really means taking the space and time for self-reflection and asking those deep questions that are a little confronting. Yeah. A little confronting. You might think, I need to practice self-compassion, so I'm going to eat a whole bunch of, I don't know, cake and ice cream. I deserve a treat. But you know that that's not a deeply compassionate act, because there will be a suffering result later, right? You're going to have a sugar high, then a crash. Then you won't have enough room in your stomach for healthy food later. Then you're going to feel fat and guilty and all whatever food dramas and issues we have, right? So in the immediate, it feels like the sweet and kind thing to do. I'm going to give myself a treat. And that urge is not wrong. But the strategy we use is not as effective as we say it is. You know, so sometimes we might revert to the old superficial, you know, give yourself some cake, you've had a hard day. That's not bad, right? You don't have to stop completely, but don't lie to yourself about what it is or its duration. Yeah, this is a short-lived symptoms relief. This is not a deep cure-all. Right? And there are deep cure-alls, and they all exist within my own mind's ability to heal itself. So, have a little cake and then go sit on your cushion, rather than have giant piece of cake and don't sit at all. Some sort of middle way, right? That's not going to trigger a sense of deprivation, especially right now when things are stressful and the tendency to feel deprivation is stronger. Right now, it's really easy for us to feel deprivation mentality, like, will I have enough toilet paper? Or will I have enough food? Or will I have enough space to myself? Or will I have enough time? And then we can get kind of a panic of, don't take what I am allowed to have, don't take that. There can be a panic, right? So, don't wrench your samsaric pleasures away from yourself like an angry parent taking all the toys from a naughty child, and then the child is crying and has no toys to distract themselves. Don't do that, right? But also don't lie to yourself about what it's doing. So, what is the thing that's nourishing? The deep and the meaningful and the focused are nourishing. They just take a little bit more effort in the beginning. And so I think there's a lot of things we do during the day that give us momentary relief that actually cost a lot of energy. Maybe certain types of conversations that we have with, certain people. Maybe you have a friend that you talk to a lot who is entertaining, and you can gossip about stuff and you can whine and complain about stuff, and it's sort of satisfying. But actually that kind of conversation winds up leaving you ultimately unfulfilled and a little maybe even guilty of time not well spent. And then there's another friend that you can have a more deep conversation with that's a little bit more confronting, but afterwards there's that satisfaction of having done something more meaningful. For example, right? Whatever your example is in your life. So noticing, sometimes you're choosing the superficial happiness, and that's fine. But if you can consciously choose the deeper kinds of happiness, it's more sustainable. And it's going to carry you through the stressful times in a much better way. Because eventually some of the tools of superficial happiness might not be available to us as accessibly. So then what are you left with? You're left with your mind's habits. Yeah. I was thinking a lot about lately how my grandparents, who are in their 90s, talked about the Great Depression. The economy crashed and everybody was poor, not just a few people, everybody was poor. And their conversations about those days, they've been telling me about the Depression or the war, my whole life. That's what people in their 90s talk about, right? Is the Depression and the war. And strangely, the stories from the Depression sound terrible on the surface, but there's all this joy when they talk about it. So they're talking about how, because they didn't have enough food to eat, they started making gardens in their backyards, and they started, hunting, and they started doing all these things. And they started collaborating with their neighbors, who they didn't used to talk to very often. But because everyone was poor and everyone was struggling, they started talking to each other, and they started helping each other. And, the people of their generation together as a unit, there's such a bond and there's such a closeness, and it's so beautiful. And yet it was born from this really terrible, deprived time. And so I was thinking, what's the worst that could happen, right? Right now with us, with the coronavirus, what's the worst that could happen? We all get really sick, lots of people die, the economy crashes, it could get really bad. Let's just go there. Rather than fearing the worst, why don't we just let our mind explore the worst? What would we do? We would look after each other, is what we would do. Yeah, we would look after each other. And if we were the only one going through this, it would be, in a way embarrassing or more painful, but because we're all going through it, there's the shared feeling of connection. So actually the pain is not as great. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, also notice how many things we do to distract ourselves from the worst case scenario of ourselves as an individual. Why don't you actually just let yourself go there in your imagination for a little while and make peace with it? And then come back to center, and it might not happen that badly anyway. But what we tend to do is read about the worst case scenario or what's happening, and we feed ourselves with too much information that's happening in the news. I was looking at Haaretz the other day, and there was all these news articles, and all of them had something to do with the coronavirus, as if there was nothing else happening in the world. So I'm like scrolling, I'm like, surely something else is happening besides this. It was all just variations of how this issue is affecting the world in the government and the blah, 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 right? And I thought, I'm getting a little overwhelmed with this information. I don't know what to do with all of this information. Is it healthy for me to keep revisiting? Yeah. So instead of worst case scenario information overwhelm, I could do worst case scenario in my imagination and make some peace with it and realize that actually it could be like the Depression in the United States or all over the world had depressions at similar times, where it actually led to better government policies, better aid for poverty. It led to new jobs and all sorts of collaboration between people that didn't exist before. It was a hard time and we don't want to invite it. And yet it wasn't that bad also. And there was a lot of richness and a lot of beauty that came from it, and that can kind of help us relax. What's the worst that can happen? All sorts of things, but what will happen? We'll look after each other. Yeah, we'll look after each other. That's what we do already. Yeah, we just do it more intentionally. Thoughts? Self-compassion being stop creating the causes for your own suffering by looking at your negative habits. Sounds less fun than going to the spa, but do you get the premise? What do you think? You're still allowed to have cake. And coffee. Okay, so yeah, thoughts?
I just want to say that I like the way you positioned it, that self-compassion is a way of looking at bad habits, because we tend to look at our character as something pathological and not to go there so quickly, because it's just to be in a pathological realm. But when you position it as a self-compassionate state, it's a different inner state around it, for us and for our patients.
Absolutely. I was noticing that there's a bit more pressure on me lately with my friends overseas, because now they realize I'm home all day and I can do online classes, and they want me to do online classes and more and more and more, because I'm at home. What else am I doing? And I want to say, I have other things that I'm doing, but anyway, there's a little bit of pressure, and I was feeling my stress level go up, and my response was I stopped exercising. And I didn't even realize it. Like, I stopped going outside for a walk for about 3 or 4 days. I didn't go outside. Like, I didn't even sit outside and like look at the garden, And it wasn't like a conscious choice. It was just what I was doing in response to the extra pressure and the extra stress. And I thought, and I suddenly caught myself and I thought, I have not been outside for 4 days. This is ridiculous. Like, get some fresh air. And so I went outside and I went for a walk. And of course I felt so happy, for my body to be moving, to get some sunshine. And then the class I taught that day was much better. Of course it was, right? It was clearer. It was more centered. I was happier. They were happier. And, and it's so simple, it's so obvious. And yet we forget these things that we already know with whatever our coping strategy is for stress. So I was really laughing at myself that I forgot something so basic, that if you look after yourself well, you're more effective to others. Duh, but, when stress comes, those basic wisdoms sometimes go out the window unless you consciously remind yourself. Yeah. Okay, would you like to do another meditation? or ask a few things before meditation? Okay. So we'll start with some very gentle analysis, and then we'll move into something a bit more spacious and some mantras at the end. And so just take a minute thinking for both myself and for others this practice. And come back to the breath. And each breath is both feeding and nourishing you, and feeding and nourishing others. Breathing in, compassion that wishes freedom from suffering. Breathing out, wishing love that is sending happiness. And now just for a moment, try to identify the experience of compassion. The wish for others to be free of suffering, the wish for yourself to be free of suffering. These are words, but use these words as an invitation to touch the experience of compassionate energy. Just take a minute to identify what is this word we use all the time, by remembering what it's like to give compassion and what it's like to receive it. Just take a moment to identify what it is experientially. What is compassion? And then very gently, without judgment, ask yourself, what is the disadvantage of when I lose my compassion for others? When I become self-centered? When I think me first? What is the disadvantage? There might be a sense of walls going up, only allowing some in, blocking others out, which might create increased irritability and annoyance. Or it might be a great relief to be in your self-centeredness until there is some sort of interruption or intrusion. There might be less skillful communication, verbally, physically, when you've lost your compassion. More mistakes. And then thinking more globally, how many of the problems of this world came from a loss of compassion? Particularly all human-created problems in this world. Would they still be there if the people with power had compassion? Think about the way that me first alienates me from everyone else. Both directions, me to them, them to me. And so self-centeredness and selfishness feel like a support or a relief or a protection, but they actually do the opposite in the long term. And so shift to the advantages of when there is compassion, starting with yourself. When you have compassion towards others, what individual benefit do you experience? How do you feel once your heart is open? And as soon as you're thinking of others, you renew your connection to them. And the sense of isolation and alienation dissolves naturally. There is flow back and forth. And thinking globally, what benefits there are when the people in power are motivated by compassion. What far-reaching benefits. So then imagine that the compassionate energy of all ordinary beings, of anything we would consider divine, of ourselves, all takes the form of a radiant white light above the crown of our head. The radiant white light above the crown of our head embodies all of this compassionate wisdom. Imagine that it moves down and absorbs into you, enriching your own compassionate wisdom, waking up what is already there, strengthening what is already there. And your body itself becomes radiant white light, filled completely up. Imagine that this radiant white light within you sends out white light in all directions, bringing compassionate wisdom to all beings, waking up their potential for it. And together with the visualization of light going out, if it feels comfortable, you can add the compassion wisdom mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. 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 Imagine the sound of the mantra, together with the light, continues to radiate out in all directions, particularly to places of illness and stress, pacifying places of anger and ignorance. And then all the environment and the beings melt into light themselves. That light gathers towards you and absorbs into your heart, where you carry the connection to all beings, as well as your intention to benefit them. And relaxing your attention. Okay. Thanks, everybody. It's really nice that you come and that we can all share these ideas together and hopefully get ourselves recalibrated to go back into the good work that we all do. So, do you have any last minute questions? Okay. If there's a suggestion of a topic you'd like to cover, let Eleanor or Claudia know, and we can do a specific topic that you're curious about. And see you next Friday.